opportunities. And she's also worked recently on Ontario's labor market, including employment precarity and the minimum wages. She holds a master's degree in developmental economics from Dalhousie University, a bachelor's of commerce degree in international business from Lakehead University, and a diploma in business management from Conestoga College. That's quite something. In the first part of the webinar, Kaylee outlined the shift in the labor market, describing the changes that have taken place on a regional basis, and looked at how some key demographic groups are faring in today's highly competitive job market. And in this concluding session, she will be discussing some strategies to overcome some of the barriers the client face in this ever-changing labor market. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Kaylee Taysen.
Good morning, everybody. How are you today? I hope everyone's doing well. We are going to be talking about the shift in the labor market and focusing on the solutions to our labor market woes. I've been really looking forward to this. So the first time we met was back in January, and we did part one of this webinar. We discussed some of the shifts that have taken place, and in the reviews that I received, there were many people saying it was great to hear this information, but there were many questions left unanswered. So I think people were wondering, what does this shift mean, and is there anything that we can do about it? So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to do sort of a refresher of the shift in the labor market. Hopefully that'll be really quick. And then we'll explore some of the solutions that are out there, sort of looking at policy and also at changing norms and attitudes of employers. And after that, we'll take some questions. So let's get started. I thought that first I would just give you a quick overview of what the CCPA Ontario is, kind of before we get into the nitty-gritty of the labor market solutions. So we are a progressive think tank. We have a national office in Ottawa, and then our provincial office is located in Toronto, right downtown. We do have offices in many provinces across the country, and we all focus on provincial and municipal issues, looking at peer-reviewed research and discussing the important things that, for us, the important things that Ontarians are concerned about. One of the things that I do is write this blog. I started with the CCPA about 1.5 years ago, and I started this blog a year ago looking at the updated numbers for the labor market. They're released by Statistics Canada the first Friday of every month, and then I write this blog. So last month it happened to be Friday the 13th, so it was nice to have it was really nice to have a theme to go on, and we just found that there was good and bad luck for Ontario job seekers in February. There was an increase in full-time work and a decrease in part-time work, which we don't see all that often, so that was great, and that's just an indication of one of the things that I do every month. So you remember back in January, we looked at the shift in the labor market and found that the largest shift has been this loss of manufacturing jobs, over 3,000 manufacturing jobs lost since the year 2000, and 300,000, and the increase, or the jobs that were lost in the manufacturing sector, have sort of been replaced by jobs in the service sector. Some of those jobs are good. Many of them are in the retail and food services industries, which traditionally we know pay very low wages and don't provide the sort of stable work that leads to a more stable life. And the shift has happened across Ontario. In every single economic region, we're looking at this shift, a loss in manufacturing jobs, an increase in service industry jobs. So no matter where you are in the province, your region is experiencing this shift as well. We also talked briefly about income, and that we've seen a decrease in the amount of people who are earning sort of a middle income, who are working at a job that gives you a middle income. You can see this chart shows there's an increase in the share of people earning under $30,000 a year, a slight increase in the share of people earning over $60,000, and then this decrease in the share of people earning $30,000 to $60,000, or that middle income. Another shift was an increase in the temporary work is growing faster than permanent work. So that means we just are seeing more precarity where people don't have stability. They don't know from month to month or from quarter to quarter whether or not they will have the job that they have now. We also talked about an increase in involuntary part-time work, and this blue line is Ontario, the purple is the rest of Canada. We have seen a huge spike in involuntary part-time work in Ontario, first of all since the recession, and now again in 2014 we saw an increase again. So that's something that I'm going to be keeping an eye on in Ontario. And then, so that looks at the quality of jobs that are available, but there's also this problem that we have where we're not actually creating enough jobs to get back to the unemployment rate we had before the recession, the employment rate we had before the recession, or even the number of unemployed Ontarians. You can see from this chart here that we'd have to bring this line actually down about 80,000 in order to have the same number of unemployed Ontarians that we had before. And finally, looking at long-term unemployment, you can see again that we had a huge spike in long-term unemployment just after the recession, and that has stayed fairly elevated since then. And again, that's another shift that we are keeping an eye on. We know that long-term unemployment, this is something actually you probably face every day. We know that long-term unemployment has a scarring effect on workers because the longer that they're separated from the world of work, the more discouraged they are, their skills are eroded. Employers see sort of long bouts of unemployment as a signal that a particular candidate is not employable. And the other question that I think of is how are the unemployed supporting themselves? We've seen that employment insurance has eroded as well, and there's less access to employment insurance than there was just half a decade ago. So how are people supporting themselves? Are they using up their savings that they had for retirement? Are they receiving social assistance? Those are all questions that, to me, are left unanswered at this point, and we need to be thinking about them. So the whole point of all of those charts was to really make 2 points. The first is that employment quality is eroding, and employment quality consists of a number of different things. So we think about wages, we think about part-time or involuntary part-time, think about temporary jobs, not having benefits, not having access to a pension, all of those sorts of things. And this chart is from CIBC Economics, and they have tracked employment quality since 1989 and found that in 2015, employment quality in Canada is at its lowest point in 25 years. And if you broke that down and looked specifically at Ontario, you'd find that over the last year, employment quality has actually eroded even further. So we need to be paying attention to that. So one side of this equation is employment quality and more people having access only to precarious or non-standard work. And then the other side of the equation is just not creating enough jobs. So if we go back to the chart I showed you earlier where we have these number of unemployed persons is still quite elevated since the recession. So we need to just be creating more jobs. There are too many people unemployed in Ontario. And if we look at this unemployment to job vacancy ratio, we'll find that there are 5.8 people or 6 people competing for every job in Ontario. So here's the number of job vacancies, and it's just 80,000. And here are the number of unemployed persons, and it's 465,000. So even if every job vacancy was filled tomorrow, we'd still have 385,000 people who are actually out of work. And that's something that we need to be focusing on. It's something that we need our governments to be focusing on. I was at a presentation a few weeks ago with the governor, a former governor of Michigan, and she was fantastic. She talked about the need for us to have leaders that are obsessed with creating jobs. And when we talk about creating jobs, you often hear green jobs, you hear innovation, you hear all about how we need more people to be self-employed so that they are creating their own destiny and all of those sorts of things. Certainly that is important, but none of that is a silver bullet. And what I took away from that presentation is that I want leaders that are sort of obsessed with jobs, but not just creating new good jobs. We also need to be looking at the jobs that we have in our labor market and making sure that those jobs are good jobs too. That's one thing that CCPA Ontario talks about all the time. Let's make sure that every job is a good job. One thing I've thought about a lot lately is I worked as a server for about 10 years. And I also love going out for dinner, and I like interacting with servers, and I like the whole sort of experience that we get there. And there's no reason why a serving job should be a bad job. In fact, I think they should be a good job. So what do we do to make sure that a serving job is a good job? What do we do to make sure that a cleaning job is a good job? You know, we will always need clean workspaces, and most people will always want to have a clean home as well. So we will always have people that are working in those jobs. We need to make sure that they are good ones. So that's where we're going with the rest of our conversation this afternoon. But before I do, there's a few things here that I want you to remember about employment precarity and non-standard work. The first is that everyone is worried about the underperforming labor market. Even people with good jobs are worried about it. So you might be worried about your child or your grandchild finding a job and finding a job that pays enough that they can, you know, live on their own and make ends meet. But you might also be actually worried about your parent or your grandparent and hoping that they will their bout of long-term unemployment will end, or that they'll be able to find a better job. I know my mom works in a very precarious job right now, where you never know from day to day when she will be working the next day, and sometimes that can be both frustrating and also very stressful. So even people with good jobs are worried about non-standard work and the underperforming labor market. The second is that this phenomenon affects each of us differently. So we talked about part-time work, we talked about temporary work, we talked about long-term unemployment, we talked about involuntary part-time work, all of these things. And it's not that every person experiencing precarious work is experiencing each of those items, but that many of us are experiencing one of those items, or maybe two. And that means that a slight increase in the share of people working temporary jobs, coupled with a slight increase in the number of people who are working part-time jobs, means that there's a larger increase in the number of people who are experiencing precarity or non-standard work. So the fact that this phenomenon affects each of us differently means that we all have a slightly different idea of what the solutions are, but the more people who are experiencing this phenomenon, the more people there are who want to do something about it, which I see as a really good thing. Here are some of the ways that the phenomenon affects us each differently. So the third is that non-standard work is seeping into more sectors and industries in our labor market. There was a recent study from York University that talked about the labor market in Ontario and what's going on, and they found that no sector, no industry is safe from non-standard work. It used to be that wage suppression or the cost of work, the suppression of the cost of employees was just a part of sort of the retail sector, the service sector, and now it's seeping in everywhere. So you find it in the financial services industry. You actually even find it in universities. This is something you might be pretty familiar with, that lots of people who at one point would have had access to a job as a professor that was permanent, that was tenured, that was long-term and well-paid, now are working month to month or semester to semester, not knowing whether they will have a job or how many courses they'll be teaching. So the non-standard work is actually seeping into more sectors and more industries. And again, that's why more people, or we would say everyone, is worried about it in one way or another. Number 4, many groups are disproportionately affected by the shift in the labor market. And this, again, will not surprise you. We certainly find that recent immigrants they experience precarity in their work relationships more often. Aboriginal people, women, young people. If you go down the list, you'll find that, in reality, it's just white guys that don't experience it disproportionately, but all these groups require slightly different solutions as well to looking at how to get out of precarity. So the 5th thing that I want you to know about precarious work in Ontario is that it doesn't have to be this way, and this is why we're here today, I think, right? We're here to talk about all of the solutions to our precarious work problem. And to me, this is really the good stuff, the stuff that I've been thinking about a lot. It's fine to, make charts and do the numbers and present the problem and define the problem, and we need to have a well-defined problem in order to talk about solutions. But we also need to start talking about solutions. So this, to me, is the good stuff, that there are solutions out there to all of these nagging problems that we've been talking about. And I think there's really 2 ways of looking at what we can do moving forward. The first is, if precarity is here to stay, and I think that's a big if. There are plenty of things we can do to just get rid of precarity altogether. But if precarity is here to stay, then what can we do to mitigate the effects of precarity on the lives of workers and their families? And that's one of the things we'll be talking about this morning. And the second, and this one is my preferred line of research, the second is to raise the bar and actually just get rid of to get rid of precarity. And for society, this is an aspirational goal. We need to make sure that the labor market delivers for everyone, and that, again, every job in Ontario is a good one. So the solutions, I've separated the solutions into 2 categories that are pretty different. It's my personal belief that both are necessary to ensure that growing prosperity in this province is experienced by everyone. I think you'll hear in the federal election, I think you'll hear that many politicians are going to start to talk about this idea of shared prosperity and how do we make sure we have shared prosperity in our wealthy country. And that's something that I certainly can get behind, and I'm really looking forward to actually seeing that conversation kind of come to its time in Canada and in Ontario. Okay, so first we're going to talk about raising the bar. And this, to me, is a very inspiring set of solutions. We're talking about raising the bar, and here we're talking about setting aspirational goals and asking employers to actually just change the narrative that they participate in when they're talking about creating jobs, and actually highlighting employers that we would see as really good employers. So they're not just job creators, but they're actually creating jobs that support a healthy and sustainable life. Over the past few decades, I think we've really actually lowered the bar considerably. So we have lower wages, fewer hours, many more people don't have access to benefits, and all because we've done this because we're told that if we don't do it, all the jobs are going to leave. That's a refrain that we hear a lot. If we don't lower our standards, then all of those employers will just leave and go hire someone else who has lower standards. I don't think that's helpful, and I think it causes us to participate in this race to the bottom where we allow all employers to choose to provide bad jobs if they want to, instead of sort of looking at setting aspirational goals that actually change the norms from one where bad jobs are better than no jobs to instead making sure that every job that we have is a good one. So let's quickly look at what's happened with wages in Canada. So since 1997, this is to 2014, median wages have actually in Ontario gone down, and since 2011 have stagnated. So we're not seeing an increase in income in income like we were promised when we said, oh, we'll cut taxes to create jobs, oh, we will balance the budget to create jobs, all of these different things. What we're seeing is wages have still flatlined. On the other hand, this quote is from the Minimum Wage Advisory Panel, and I've done a lot of work. Around the minimum wage in Ontario and looking at how it could be raised, why it needs to be raised, all of those things. And from the Minimum Wage Advisory Panel, they said it can be argued that Ontario needs a high wage strategy to maintain and foster its prosperity. So if we go back to this chart where we're seeing median wages actually stagnate, and then to a government-sponsored panel that found that we need a high wage strategy to maintain and foster prosperity. That's something that I can get behind, and it's something that I think more people need to think about. There is a campaign that's being launched this week, next week on April 15th for 15 and Fairness, and it's all about raising the minimum wage and improving employment standards so that everyone has access to a better job. So if we look at what's happened to the share of employees earning the minimum wage in Ontario, you'll see that it increased, it doubled. Between 2003 and 2011, the share of workers working the minimum wage actually doubled over that period of time. We also found that 40% of minimum wage workers are over 25. So you'll often hear, oh, you don't need to worry about that minimum wage worker because they're just a teenager. They're just trying to make ends, or just trying to sort of gain experience in the labor market. But we're finding that 40% of those workers are actually over 25. Another important thing to note is that the value of the minimum wage has eroded substantially in the last 20 years, and in fact in Ontario you now have to work double the hours that you would have worked 20 years ago in order to pay tuition. So instead of working 2 months to pay tuition and 2 months to pay for living expenses, students are now working 4 months to pay tuition and are having to borrow for living expenses and other things. Another important point is just that 45% of all minimum wage employees work for corporations with more than 500 employees, which just means that more are working for large corporations. And then this is full-time minimum wage earnings as a portion of the poverty line. I find this chart to be really interesting because if you look back here, 1976, the minimum wage actually meant a worker was not living in poverty if they were working full-time. So that's 35 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, assuming they don't have access to sick time. So that assumes that they've had some sick time or they've had to take time off for their kids, and that's all unpaid. So 35 hours a week for 50 weeks. In 1976, the minimum wage meant that you were not living in poverty. And that quickly eroded, and there's been a bit of a roller coaster since then, but you can see that now the minimum wage still keeps workers. If you're working full-time, workers are still living in poverty. And in my opinion, that should not be the case. Another benchmark that we could look at for the minimum wage, oh, I guess I should mention here that the campaign, the 15 and Fairness campaign, is advocating for a $15 minimum wage, and that is the minimum wage that would make sure workers who are working full-time at the minimum wage would not be living in poverty. Would mean that work actually is the best pathway out of poverty instead of that sort of argument being untrue. Another benchmark that we can look at is the average industrial wage. And historically, the minimum wage was sort of notionally pegged between 50 and 60% of the average industrial wage. And in some countries, it's actually set at 60%. So if you look to France, the minimum wage is set to 60% of the average industrial wage, which would bring us more to like $15. New Zealand has the same, and there are a number of other countries as well. But in Ontario, even at $11 an hour, The current minimum wage is only 44% of the average industrial wage. So we'd like to see a fairly large increase in the minimum wage over time. All right, so that's the minimum wage, and that's one of the solutions to mitigating or reducing precarity and making that reduction permanent, is just making sure that people are earning enough money that they can actually live above the poverty line. Another solution to wages is talking about the living wage. Here's just a quote from a living wage employer in, I believe that's in Kitchener-Waterloo. "Paying a living wage is good for business. Staff turnovers plummet, service quality and employee morale increases, and productivity actually improves. The return on investment is significant." So that's an employer talking about the value of paying employees enough money that they are able to make ends meet. They're able to afford the basics in life so that they're not scrambling every month to figure out how to pay the bills and put food on the table, to make sure that their kids have enough money to, you know, go on field trips and all of those sorts of things. And there are a number of cities in Ontario that have calculated a living wage. There's actually some community groups across Ontario. They've been coming together to support the living wage movement. This is a list of some of them. You'll see Toronto is $16.60, and that actually was calculated in 2008. We will be releasing Toronto's updated living wage calculation on Friday. You can look for it online, and hopefully in newspapers and other places there's a updated number for what it actually takes to live in Toronto, and we will be updating that number every year going forward, which is great. The other thing is that there are a ton of employers who are signing up to be living wage employers, and they're you know, kind of putting their hand up and saying, hey, this is something that we're finding is really good for our business. It's part of their value system. So Duca, the Bank on Moore, they're a credit union located in Toronto. They pay a living wage, and they've done that as part of their commitment to creating a better society and also being a good employer. They've decided it's not enough to just provide any job for their employees, but they want to make sure they're providing jobs that are that provide for a sustainable, healthy, meaningful life. It means that their employees can participate in the community, and for some of their employees that will be receiving a raise soon, it also means that they might not have to work 2 jobs anymore. So that's something that we're really very happy to see. And this sort of employer engagement strategy is one that's being promoted across the province, and we're finding in Windsor employers are signing up, and in fact the Chamber of Commerce supported and partnered on the living wage launch. This is, you know, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce came out last year saying that the minimum wage shouldn't be raised. It should only be pegged to inflation because it would be bad for business. And now they're saying at the sort of more local level that living wages are good for their local economy. So it's a great change to see. Some other points about raising the bar are looking to more robust employment standards. And the Ontario government is actually going through an employment standards review right now. You can go online and provide your input anytime you want over the next few months. And here are a couple of things that I've heard different organizations talk about, and these are solutions that I certainly can get behind as well. So robust employment standards mean eliminating the exemptions to the minimum wage standards. So we talked about an $11 an hour minimum wage, but there are many exemptions to that. So tipped workers don't have to make the $11 an hour minimum wage. It's actually less. Young workers also face a lower minimum wage. If you're under 20 years old, then your minimum wage is lower. Some agricultural workers as well are exempt from earning the higher minimum wage. And you know what happens then is we are supplementing that wage with tips, which on sort of one point is great, but at the same time it means that people are relying on generosity. It means that they're relying on their restaurant being very busy in order to make the wage that they're used to. So it just makes for more precarity, and some people are saying we need to eliminate the exemptions to those minimum wage standards and just make sure that everybody is earning everyone has access to the same minimum wage no matter what their job is and no matter what their age is. Both of those are very important. All right, so the next one here is more paid vacation time and also paid sick leave. So in Ontario, you are required to receive 2 weeks paid vacation. For many workers, that comes in the form of an increase of 4% on every paycheck. So instead of receiving the paid vacation time later, what you get is an extra 4% on your paycheck. This, again, is something that I got when I worked as a server for so many years. And the Workers Action Center, they're based in Toronto, and they put out a paper this week. This is one of the things that they're calling for, is more paid vacation time and vacation time that actually increases with the amount of experience or seniority that you have at your job. So for the first 2 years, maybe you have 3 weeks paid vacation, and then once you have 5 years experience, you get more paid vacation, which just recognizes your experience and your seniority within the workplace. And there are a few countries across the world that actually provide for this. I believe in Australia you get 4 weeks paid vacation right off the top. And then another strategy is paid sick leave. So right now, there are many people in the province who don't actually have access to paid sick leave. This picture here, I apologize for it not being as clear as it could have, is a picture of a worker who's dressed as the flu, and he's saying, "Hi, I'm the flu, and I'll be making your lunch today." This picture just reminded me of going through the drive-through at a fast food restaurant in my hometown and watching the person working behind the counter coughing into their shoulder and continuing to make my lunch. And part of the reason that people do that is they don't have access to paid sick leave, which means if they're sick and they don't go to work, they don't have that income. If you're already working at $11 an hour, then missing a day of work takes a huge chunk out of the amount of money that you have to pay your bills, and it just means that people don't have the incentive to take time off, to stay home, and to rest. So as part of the employment standards overhaul, making sure that all people have access to paid sick days is very, very important, and reduces how people experience precarity. It means that more people, this is just another element of making sure every job is a good job. All right, so more robust employment standards. Here are a few more. One is parity pay, and the other is full and equal benefits. So if we're talking about parity pay, that just means people who are doing the same job, standing side by side at an employer's place of business, they're earning the same amount of money. Right now we have some people working who might be unionized. They might have been at their place of employment for a long time and they're earning a pretty decent wage. Excuse me. At the same time, there are people working in those jobs that are temporary, that are part-time, that aren't on contract. They're receiving a far lower wage, and they also may not have access to those benefits that the longer-term workers have, which creates a whole lot of problems, both in the workplace and in the lives of people who are experiencing precarious work. So we would fully advocate for parity pay or equal pay. Equal work for equal pay, making sure that everyone is recognized for the work that they do to keep our economy moving, and that we all are to recognize that we're all participating in our own way to make sure that Ontario is a prosperous province, and making sure that people earn the money that is, or earn the increased income that is created from their work. Another one that we can talk about is overtime exemptions. This is one that I was not really aware of until recently when I started doing a little bit more reading. There are all sorts of overtime exemptions where employers can apply to the provincial government to be totally exempt from paying overtime. So you still pay overtime, but you don't have to pay time and a half or those sorts of things. Or it's possible that you average overtime over the course of 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, so that an individual might be working 15 hours a day in January and 10 hours a day, or 10 hours a day in February, and you would just average that overtime over the lifetime of the contract, which just means that there is less pay for that employee for the overtime that they're working. Here are just a few more cartoons. So when I think about overtime, I get excited because it means time and a half. And when you think about a manufacturing job, I often think about the worker who's working on the line. They're working overtime. They get paid time and a half for that overtime. And it actually helps to supplement the fact that they are working more than they, maybe working more than they wanted or more than they expected. And this is more the reality that people are seeing overtime in overtime provisions today. So they don't get a title, they don't get a promotion, and they don't get a raise, but they get all the unpaid overtime they want. So that's just a reflection of what's happening in the labor market right now. And finally, on the raising the bar side of things, is that we've talked about employment standards and having more robust employment standards, but it's not enough to just have good employment standards. We also need to make sure that those employment standards are enforced. Here you can see this is an example of what enforcers or people who enforce employment standards might be thinking as they're looking at enforcing employment standards. They're just not enforced to the same way that they used to be, and they're certainly not enforced to the same way that we would like to see. So instead of just sort of looking the other way, I think it's really important that we have increased funding for employment standards enforcement so that the new, more robust standards are meaningful, and also increased protections for workers who make claims so that it's not a question of whether or not they will lose their job if they make a claim, but that the claim will be investigated and dealt with appropriately, and both of those are very important. Okay, so the next set of solutions is all about mitigating precarity. So if precarity is here to stay and it's now a part of our labor market experience forever and ever, then what can we do to mitigate precarity? And one of the things that we can do is implement public programs that help workers and all of us achieve more stability in our lives. Some programs that we have right now that you can think of would be universal health care, for example, is a huge one. It means that we're not worried about whether or not we're not worried to the same extent that we would be if we didn't have universal health care, whether or not we have a health issue. It's not going to cost us significantly more money. We have that protection there. So implementing public programs that help workers achieve stability in their lives is very, very important. The first that I have to talk about is universal, low-cost, flexible childcare. So families in Ontario are really struggling to afford childcare. If you look at this next slide, you'll see the cost, how much this is an affordability index. How affordable is childcare in Ontario and in cities across the country? So in Brampton, 36% of the average woman's income goes to childcare. In Surrey, BC, it's 35%. In Toronto, it's 34%. So that's a huge portion of income that is going to childcare in Ontario. And what we're talking about here is actually instituting an affordable, universal, low-cost child care program so that all families actually have a real choice in whether or not they stay home and are stay-at-home parents or go out to work and enter the labor force. Right now, particularly in Toronto and Brampton, the cost of childcare is such that it prices a lot of people out of even going back to work. If you're working a job that only pays $11 an hour, childcare might not actually mean, if you have to pay for childcare, then you might not actually bring home any money. So then what's the point in going, except that we know if you don't remain attached to the labor force, then finding a job once your kids go back to school is that much more difficult. So affordable childcare is very, very important and would help to mitigate the precarity that many people feel as part of their labor market experience. So the next is universal extended health benefits. And here we would look at a national pharmacare program, and that actually is being supported and promoted by the NDP at the federal level. And we could also look at extended health benefits for everybody. One of the greatest struggles that's faced by precarious workers is this little to no access to extended health benefits. And the lower your income, the less likely you are to have health benefits at all. So extra supports like dental care, vision care, pharmacare, they're extremely expensive if you have to purchase them yourself in the open market, but are very valuable if they're provided either by an employer or through a government program, and that's something that we would certainly advocate to see more of. Here's a picture of a man that we studied back in 2011. The picture here up on the left is before receiving support for extended health benefits, and then here's the picture after. So he was really struggling to find a job, trying to find a job that could help him make ends meet, and he actually saw his teeth replaced, had a lot of dental work, and all of a sudden he was seen as more employable and a lot more confident in his ability to find a job, and it just helped him dramatically. Another really interesting idea is precarity pay, and it's one that I'm intending to research more extensively sort of as time goes on. It comes from Australia, and it's a government policy that requires employers to pay a premium to workers who are in precarious situations. So if there is an employer that says, having a precarious workforce is essential to my business model, that's fine, but there are also required then employers that are insisting on temporary or casual employment relationships, they have to then compensate their employees for that by actually paying a 15 to 25% premium on their hourly wage. 15 to 25% premium on their hourly wage. To me, that was huge. So you can see here, here's a worker who's forced into a precarious situation. This guy is a sort of looks like he would have a really good job, but there he is, very precarious. You could also think of a 19-year-old working at a fast food restaurant. That worker, if they are working as a casual employee, will earn $18.52 per hour Australian. Working at a fast food restaurant, $18.52 per hour, and that's a $3.70 premium over their full-time counterpart. So the full-time worker actually makes less money, but has more hours in their day. And that pay differential is meant to compensate casual employees for the fact that they don't have guaranteed hours. They don't have guaranteed hours every week. They're not entitled to benefits like paid annual leave or sick leave like we talked about before. So this, it could be that they just receive additional pay, but it's also possible to set up a precarity pay fund that supports workers when they lose their temporary jobs or are laid off. I would argue that what we really need to see in that situation is just improved employment insurance standards. But either way, it can relieve some of the stress in being in these types of situations that you see on the screen. So there we are. There's actually a safety net for people who are experiencing precarious work. Another really important way that employers can mitigate precarity is providing cross-training as part of their employment strategy. So we see the responsibility of training downloaded to the individual, but every sector has a role to play in training their workforce for the future. And this cross-training is an idea that comes out of the retail sector. So if you think about Costco, for example, Costco has a reputation for being a really good employer. They also seem to provide really good jobs, and they cross-train all of their employees in more than one skill, so that depending on what time of day you're working and what skill is required, the same worker can perform multiple jobs in multiple roles. So here, again, I apologize for this picture not being as clear as I expected, but here you can see all of these workers, and they're all just trained in one skill. So they might all be cashiers, and the only thing that they're trained to do is be a cashier. If it's not busy, then one of those cashiers just gets sent home. With cross-training, what you'll see is one worker is trained in a multitude of skills. So here you see someone who's running, the same person is biking, swimming, and lifting weights. That training means that if, let's say this weightlifter is a cashier, and all of a sudden it's not busy and they don't need as many cashiers, that worker could then go work in the warehouse unloading merchandise. They could go stock shelves. There are so many things that could be done to put together a full-time job instead of just training workers for one type of work and then having a huge labor force. That's unnecessary. Finally, we're looking here at including all workers. So sometimes when you have a labor force, some people are permanent, some people are temporary, some people are full-time, some people are part-time. Everyone is treated differently. Some people have benefits and a pension, and some people don't. And that can cause a lot of division in an employment relationship in a business. So sometimes it's just the little things that make a big difference in life. So if you're a worker who's experiencing precarity and you're temporary, you might not get invited to the company picnic or those sorts of things. But research from the Poverty and Employment Precarity in Southwestern Ontario, this group of researchers, suggests that including temporary workers as part of the team, taking them to team building events, going to the company picnic, going on the retreat, all of those things, treating them with more respect can actually go a long way to mitigating some of the stigma that goes along with precarity. So this is another way that employers can change the way they act in order to become better employers, basically, and to provide better jobs. Oh, we have 10 minutes left. Okay, improving employment insurance. Some research recently found that employment insurance coverage is dropping in many, many cities across the country, and that is the direct result of the government of Canada actually eroding employment insurance standards. So we would advocate for increasing those standards so that more people have access to that and actually know that they will be supported if they do lose their job. We're just going to move past these. Let's see. So for youth, there are a couple of direct interventions we've seen from the government for youth jobs in Ontario. We know that young people face precarity, or new entrants face precarity in the labor market more than people who have been around for a while. So there's some government intervention. There's the youth employment strategy at the federal level and the youth job strategy at the provincial level. The largest portion of that is encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. And again, I think encouraging those things is really great, but we also know that self-employment and entrepreneurship can be really precarious. as much as 4 out of 5 businesses fail. 50% of all app developers, so people who work in IT, on average, or 50% of all app developers earn less than $100 a month in the United States. So we're encouraging all of this entrepreneurship and innovation, but it's a very precarious way to live. We think it's this sort of big ticket item, but that's only true for a few who are very lucky. So what I'd like to see instead is more on-the-job training and mentorship for young people, so that there's a knowledge transfer from one worker who's been around for a long time to another, as well as looking to make sure that employers are staying committed to their employees, looking for loyal and talented employees, and then actually sort of fostering that relationship so that it ends up being a long-term relationship instead of a short-term relationship. Okay, so that was a long list of solutions, a very long list of solutions. The point of that is just to say that it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to have the precarious labor market that we've been developing over the last 20 years. We can either ask businesses to do better, and I think we need to. We need to change the sort of norms and structures that we've allowed to develop around the employer-employee relationship. And we can also institute public programs that mitigate precarity and ensure that everyone has access to more of the things that lead to a sustainable, stable, healthy life. So that's the list of the solutions that I've gone over. And the point is that there are plenty of alternatives, and there are lots of things that we can do to change the situation in the labor market for a very large group of people. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. This has been great.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody. That was a very interesting and absorbing presentation. And I have a question here from Carl.
Okay.
Given the complex and compounding factors like credential recognition, limited Canadian job experience, and xenophobia affecting newcomers getting attached to the labor market, what specific policy measures do you see would make a difference for this particular cohort? So that was his question.
And so you're talking about new entrants,
new entrants,
specifically
yes.
Immigrants, people without Canadian experience? Okay, so I have not focused particularly on one group of people, but I have heard a lot of people just talking about government sort of putting their feet, or walking their talk. So we see government saying that we look to experienced workers who have to take a test to make sure that they have the skills that we're looking for when we accept immigrants into the country, but they're not connected to a job that recognizes those skills, or they're told that they need Canadian experience, and that all becomes very difficult. There are lots of different solutions to that. I don't have one in particular, and I think that there is no silver bullet to any of these, anything that has to do with precarious work that people are experiencing. We need to look at the whole suite of options, and one of them would be making sure that government actually walks their talk.
Yeah, that's so true. That's one of those issues, like it's like a white elephant sitting there with no answers. Any other questions? Oh yeah, Tarunam has one.
Okay.
She asked, as frontline workers, how could we get involved with supporting this cause?
That is a great question. I think I mentioned earlier that the provincial government is going through the process right now of reviewing Ontario's Employment Standards Act. There is a campaign that's being run by the Workers' Action Centre, and they talk about a lot of the solutions I've talked about here today, and actually many more. There are a number of recommendations that they're putting forward. They would be somewhere to go where you could find out how to get involved in building a more robust employment standard system, and also talking about this at the dinner table. I have a reputation now in my family for Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, the list goes on, of talking about all of these issues with my family members, many of them who are actually employers. So we talk about the living wage and why paying a living wage is important and why increasing the minimum wage is important, and actually why paying taxes is important in supporting all of these extended health benefits or precarity pay, all of these different things, affordable childcare. Talking about it and calling people out when they are spreading false information is actually a really important way to change our norms and change our expectations, and it's one that we don't talk about very often.
Yeah, I like this, the fact about talking, we usually discount it as nothing, but these baby steps are so important, so crucial than something, a large-scale advocacy, like, sometimes it's so powerful, this little word of mouth.
Yeah, instead of just perpetuating what we hear in the news, what we hear or what we read in the newspaper, to do more research and actually kind of call people out when they're spreading false information, or even just to talk about these things in a more positive way with your family and your friends, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's true. And one of the interesting things that really caught my attention was when you introduced that young man whose appearance had a lot of things to do with his employability,
Mm-hmm.
and with that health plan, very good, get his dentures fixed and everything, and all of a sudden things started, happening to that person. So
yeah, and with the erosion of our sort of social safety net over the last 30 years, things like extended health benefits, even for people who are receiving social assistance, who there is no way they would be able to pay for dental care. They have to wait until there is an emergency situation before they can get a tooth fixed. So instead of filling a cavity, they have to, because there's no money to fill a cavity, they have to wait until they need a root canal in order to get the services that they need. And that means that health problems are not prevented, they're just dealt with on an emergency basis. So if we had a little bit more money in the system, or a more flexible system, that would mean more support for people, and that people didn't have to sort of hit the bottom of the barrel before we provided assistance in moving forward.
that's true, well said. We have time for one more question. Anybody has any more questions? Looks like you've given a lot of food for thought.
Good.
Yeah, right. Okay, so on behalf of the entire JSW crew, Kelly, we thank you so much for your time and a very wonderful presentation.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it as well.
Thank you all, and everybody have a wonderful day and the rest of the week. Bye.